Just kidding. Hey, Sherry,
Um,
how's it going?
hey, it's going
Hey,
good.
good to see you.
It's going good to see you
I
too.
know. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's really good. I'm Sherri, and this is my good friend Tiffany or
Hello,
Tiff or TJ, whatever you
or
want to call
Tiffy,
her.
or
Tiffy,
whatever.
yeah.
My grandpa always used to say, "You can call me anything you want, just don't call me late for dinner."
That's a good one. That's a good one.
All about the food.
Nice. And so I've been working on my blog and in videos I've been putting out in December. I've been talking about Christmas underdogs, folks that show up not a lot in the Christmas story, but have really significant stories to tell. Last week, we talked about Joseph, and this week, I want to talk about the shepherds. And we're in a new format this week because here in the new year, have a podcast that's going to be launching. And so we figured we'd come and set up and test things out and do the video in
It's
here today.
about time, Sherry.
I know,
It's about
I know I
time.
wouldn't say it out loud for forever, but now I've said it. It's out there in the world.
Yes.
So here we are.
I'm
Yeah.
excited to be here.
I'm so glad
Yeah,
you're here.
me too. I watch a lot of football. Do you
Mhm.
watch football in your house?
Not really.
No.
Just
Okay, yeah, so my husband and my son are, like, huge football people
mhm.
because I'm associated with that. I've gotten into it, and I find myself always rooting for the underdog. Always rooting for the
Yeah.
underdog. I don't care who's playing. I want the team that always wins, I want them to lose. In thinking about that, what is an underdog?
I think we've all related to it. And I think that it's somebody who has odds stacked against them. It's the
Mhm.
person you don't expect. It's somebody that surprises you when they do well or when they're successful. And it's smaller characters, people with smaller roles
Sure.
in any given story.
I know that last week on Everyday Truths,
Mhm.
you talked about Joseph, and this week we're talking
The
about,
shepherd.
okay, what made them the underdog in that particular time?
Yeah, if I can give a little bit of history, shepherds traditionally weren't looked down upon, but once we hit the first century when Jesus is born, they're just absolutely considered like the lowest of the low. Their testimony doesn't count in court. They're not able to participate in a lot of religious contexts. They're very much underdogs and looked down upon. But if we go back to the Old Testament, we don't see this same prejudice against them. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all shepherds. Later, we see David as a shepherd. We see shepherds as folks that are in some ways looked up to. We see God consider himself or described as a shepherd. Probably the most well-known instances is in Psalm 23. The Lord is
He's
my
my
shepherd, I
shepherd.
shall not want. My favorite part of that, and I think this is what I want to jump into in January, is his goodness and his righteousness will pursue me all the days of my
Right.
life like a good shepherd. We see this used for God, but in
Right.
between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see these religious elite emerge. Commonly, you see the Pharisees, even though there were some other folks, they got into it with Jesus a lot. It's interesting then when you see people that Jesus gets mad at, it's people who are being a barrier to people who
Right.
are seeking God. Really
Right.
interesting. Not just people who are doing all the wrong things. He gets down in the dirt with those folks. I mean, he
Sure.
tells them, hey, don't do those things. More complex than that. But in between, when the religious elite emerged, they started adding to the law. And
Mhm.
so the shepherds in the Old Testament, we see these laws about, say, cleanliness, which were really, really important because it kept the community safe. Then when we fast forward, we see these oral traditions begin where they're adding to the law, like the Sabbath. They added 39 requirements onto the Sabbath. And when they did that, they did nothing but exclude the folks in the margins. They said, hey, you absolutely can't do anything. They just kept adding and adding and adding. You know, gosh, a sheep could run off on the Sabbath. Like, what are you going to do? And so now they're excluded for something that in their life that needs to be done, that's daily part of their life. Unwritten rules that push people out onto the fringe. And so they were just mistreated.
We go back to
Why?
what we started this with, right? Like, all the odds are stacked against
All
us.
the odds are stacked against them. And so we see this transition, and it wasn't because the shepherds were bad. They may have done things that, like we all do,
Who hasn't?
who
Girl,
hasn't?
who
I
hasn't?
know,
Girl.
but we see this transition where it was all the technicalities that pushed them to the fringe, not just who they inherently were.
Right.
You have to imagine, like back when shepherds in the Old Testament, they traveled around. Well, now you have the establishment of these big cities, and so they get pushed to the fringes.
That just puts the exclamation point on the idea that God chose underdogs
Hmm.
and continues to choose
Hmm.
underdogs. So why would you think that God would choose specifically a shepherd? This is all personal opinion. I'm
No,
just,
I love this. I love
yeah.
because okay, so let me bookend Jesus' life and ministry.
right?
We see the shepherds in the beginning, and I'll go back to such a cool thing. But at the end, another group of people that weren't trusted to give a testimony in court were women. And then we see
Mm,
the shepherds, the first evangelists, and then we see women who were the first to get to Jesus' tomb and to go and share the good news that he was risen. And
right.
so from beginning to end, we see God highlight underdogs. Jesus gives dignity to shepherds, to Samaritans, to servants, to women, and the list could go on and on. And
To
so,
you, to me,
yeah.
to you, to me, like,
Mhm.
he's constantly in the business
Yeah.
of bringing people out of the
Yes.
marginalization,
If you read through Luke chapter 2, where the story of Jesus' birth is, it's you see Jesus was born and he was placed in a manger. And
right?
the next word is, and there were shepherds.
Mm,
It's part of one train of
one
thought.
sentence.
Some
Yeah.
translations kind of put a few words in between it.
Sure.
But if you look at the Greek, it's, hey, Jesus put in a manger and it's like an inclusion. It's not this separate thought. And it's a
Right.
conjunction
Or an
junction. What's your
afterthought.
function? Yeah. It's it's
Conjunction with your function.
yeah. And so
If you know, you know.
Schoolhouse Rock. And so it's really cool that they're tied in. There's an artist I've been obsessed with. If you're like sensitive to profanity, not an artist to listen to, but there's a
Sure.
woman that's named Rory. She's really, it's neat. She was an addict for years and came to know God and started a music career when she was like 40.
That's phenomenal.
Oh yeah,
She was
incredible.
an underdog.
Oh, oh, man. Her mom died in her 20s, and so, you get to like, life hits you,
Yes.
you can become an underdog, and she was an addict, and all of these
Just
different
like
things,
bam, bam,
one thing
bam.
after another, and
Yeah.
she has this song, and it's called "In the Bible," and there's a line in it. The Bible says that God will send a fool to shame the wise, but you didn't see me coming, as she
Mm,
sees herself as the fool. And then she says, I'm not a pastor, not a preacher. I haven't lived a righteous life. I'm just an addict on my knees with my face towards the light. Just a direct parallel is the shepherds. And maybe we should walk through the story quickly here in a second. But the shepherds, as the angels appeared and they had this light, there were these underdogs. And then all of a sudden, with their face towards the light, as this good news was shared with them, it's just incredible that they would be the beginning of the story. And in that, we see who Jesus came for. We see God's character.
sure.
We see that no one should be excluded because there are a lot of people that the angels could have showed up to. He could have showed up to the religious elite. It's just like, okay, and the temptation of Jesus. Jesus is standing on top of the temple and Satan says, jump,
Mhm.
right? And angels will catch you. What's happening there, if you're familiar with the story, it's like what's happening there is if he were to jump and angels were to catch him, everyone, all the important people, all the religious elite would see him and be behind him
Right.
and go, this is the guy. It would have made everything a lot easier for Jesus.
Sure.
And this is the same thing. The angels could have gone to the religious elite, to the important people. And in this, we see God's priority to seek the lost, right? Is it not the sick who need a physician?
Right.
And so in this, we get this beautiful image of who God is, who Jesus is here for.
Right, right, absolutely. If you celebrate Christmas in any way, you kind of know the nativity, like, you know the Christmas story, kinda know what happens. We have Jesus
Mhm,
born in a manger,
mhm,
right? There's no room at the inn. Mary's big old preggo.
mhm,
She's gonna have this baby. There's no way to stop it. They're traveling. "Go stay in the barn," is
mhm.
what they're told. And then tell me what happens.
So Jesus is born, and there were shepherds.
"And there were shepherds," okay?
So they're in their fields, and angels appear to them, and they basically are like, "Hey, the Messiah, this person that everybody's been waiting on, he's here."
Okay, so let me ask you this question
Mhm.
as before we move forward. I have 2 questions that just popped in my head. One is, were the shepherds aware how much of an underdog they were?
I think they were well aware of how much they were rejected.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
And
they knew.
mhm,
They knew we're marginalized,
mhm,
we're the least of these.
mhm,
That's why we're out here. We we cannot engage in community in the way
mhm,
that our souls desire
mhm.
to, right? So they were aware of what their position was. So, just a personal question, how do you think that felt for them to have an angel of the Most High God appear to them? I know how I have felt in those moments in my life where I'm like, "Oh." Tiff, like, you've done too much. You've gone too far.
Mhm.
There's no going back. We've had those moments in our lives
Mhm.
where we go, this sin is too much, or my shame is too
Mhm.
heavy. I can't even face him. It's one thing to feel that on yourself, but to feel that on yourself and have an entire community around you treat you as if,
Mhm.
I know how I feel in those moments where I'm like, "Oh, God sees me."
Mhm.
Like, what do you think that the shepherds felt in those moments?
And so I'll say it's difficult to know the attitude of the shepherds
Sure.
because you have some folks who really identify and take pride in a community that someone else looks down on. So that is
Mhm.
difficult, but it is so important to remember that it was specifically the religious community that excluded them. I wonder if, like, the average person, they had to do trade with them. And so we don't know how the average person.
Sure. So they functioned in their society,
Yeah.
however, comma,
Mhm.
the elitist
Yes.
definitely looked down on
And
them.
so with the religious community, they had heard, I'm sure, so much about who they were, how they could be involved. I brought up the Sabbath
That's
earlier. It was like, because, gosh, a sheep could run off on the Sabbath. What are you going to do? They had added all these rules. And so now they're excluded for something that in their life that needs to be done, that's a daily part of their life. And so
right.
this legalism that excluded them, I think that then having angels show up to them,
Yeah.
it's,
That's such an important point to
yeah.
be very specific of that the religious community is the one
Mhm.
that excluded them,
Told
and
them they
then
were unworthy because of
right.
who they were.
And then in a religion,
Mhm.
within their religious perspective, like, an angel of the Lord appears.
Mhm.
So now we see the juxtaposition
Oh, yeah.
of the 2.
And I think it's like they would have seen the religious elite as the gatekeepers. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden it's like, man, it's a game of checkers because the angels didn't stop for their permission. Hey, are these
Sure.
guys worthy? Like, are we
Right.
good?
Yeah.
They jumped right over the religious elite to come to the lowest according to society. And that's who they showed up for. Imagine just the shock of these humble people who spent their time outside, who slept in fields, who took care of animals. This shock that would have happened when these angels appeared.
Sure.
I don't know that they would have been thinking about their marginalization, but I think they would have been really thinking about this incredible blessing. And you know what, though? When I think about it, I don't think they knew that the angels didn't show up for other people.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. I think
That's
it's
fascinating.
yeah, but I think it's one of those things, right? When you are in the presence of God,
Hmm.
you don't think about yourself anymore. You're
Hmm.
thinking about him.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're not thinking, "Oh, I'm marginalized. Oh, I'm full of shame." All you're experiencing, right, is the glory of God.
Hmm.
And that is what they experienced in that moment in a way that they were never able to before in their life. And
Hmm.
so it's this new thing.
Yep.
Like, I remember the first time that I was just, like, completely overtaken by the Spirit. It's like a zone. That's the only
Hmm.
way that you can explain it, is, like, you're, like, in the zone, and you are protected, and you're not thinking about anything else, and you're just
Hmm.
moving, and you're just speaking, and you're just
Hmm.
doing, because you're full, you're whole,
Yeah.
right? So, in that moment, to me, in that moment that the angels appeared, they felt a wholeness in them that they had
Hmm.
never felt
Yeah.
before,
Hmm.
right? And that's an incredible
Hmm.
thing for the God of the universe to say, I am going to take the least of these. I'm going to take the underdog. I'm going to take you. I'm going to take you,
Hmm.
whether you were born into it or whether you chose and got yourself into this or both of those things. I am going to give you the dignity
Oh
like you
gosh.
said
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
And that's just so beautiful. It's
Yeah.
such a beautiful picture of who God is.
And I think here we see a really, really awesome parallel, right? Because to receive, your hands have to be open. And I think we see this paralleled where the Pharisees and where other folks that responded to Jesus when they saw the miracles and his knowledge and all of these pieces bundled together, some of them had open hands and received that. And
Sure.
others who were convinced that they were already righteous, they didn't. And we see in the shepherds that when the angels leave, they're immediately obedient. They respond
Mhm.
to what they've been told is true. They had this joy and they
Yeah.
obeyed and they
Listen and obey.
went
Yeah.
to where the angels had told them. I mean, I don't know if any of them had any skepticism, but I know they went. It's so significant. We see this
Yeah.
parallel. It's your hands have to be open to receive, and theirs
They
were.
were open.
They were. Yeah, they obeyed and they had that faith and they went.
Yeah. That's a message in and of itself for each of us.
Mhm.
When God reveals himself to us,
Mhm.
are we willing to listen and obey?
Yes.
Are we willing to follow the star? When God shows up and says, "Here I am," are we willing to pursue Jesus?
If we don't respond, if we don't obey, if we don't have our hands open, we're not going to
Right.
receive that. We're not going to
Right.
receive what it is that God has for us. And we see here in the shepherds that they did. It shows us so many incredible things,
Give
so
me
many incredible
3.
things. God can work in people even if we don't agree with it. How often are we like,
Yeah.
is that legitimate? Like, it happens a lot when celebrities come to know Jesus.
Yeah,
It's like
like
when Justin Bieber
Justin
did,
Bieber. I was
and
just
people are
thinking
like
about
dogging
Justin.
him and
Yeah.
things like that. Like, wait, hold on.
Right.
Who are you to say that?
Who right.
And so I think people would say, no, the shepherds aren't qualified to hear from God,
And yet,
and yet. And so I think we see that God can work even if our eyes aren't open to how he's working in someone else's
yeah.
life. Think about the wise men. They weren't Jewish, and
Right.
yet God gave them a star
Yes.
to come and to find his son. And so I think we don't have to agree with it for God to be able to move and for him to be able to work, but we do need to keep our eyes open and recognize that.
Yes.
And that it's possible and open our heart to it and not put God in a box that he can only move and work in ways that make sense to us.
Right, and that's interesting that you say that because the whole Christmas story that is told in churches, especially during the season, is, the angel visited Mary, and Mary says, "How can this happen?" And the angel says, "Nothing is impossible with God.
Nothing.
Nothing.
hmm
Nothing is impossible with
hmm
God."
And then we haven't even gotten into this, but they went and told people they're kind of the first evangelists in the sense that the Messiah is here. Let me look. I just want to make sure I get the wording
Yeah,
just
for
right.
sure.
And it says, and when they saw it, they made known the saying that had happened, that had been told to them concerning the child. And all who heard it wondered at what the shepherds told them. Wondered as in they're like, wow, not like
Yeah.
wondered as
Not
in
like,
like, oh,
"Are they right?"
yeah.
But yeah.
They went and told people about what they had seen. So they didn't only open-handedly respond and obey what they had seen, but they also went and they told others about it, which is so significant. Our experiences aren't meant to just be to be ours. The boldness to share what God has given us, has done for us, because in that we can come alongside a long history of people, including these shepherds, who have taken what God has done and gone and shared it with somebody else.
Right.
Yeah.
The scripture popped in my head. He comforts you so that you can comfort others.
Mhm.
And I think about when you were speaking, I was thinking about the shepherds and what a comforting feeling it
Mhm.
was to know that they were included
Mhm.
and to want to go out and tell everybody and share that comfort, that sense of belonging, maybe even for some of them the first time of their lives.
Yeah, it's so cool. I've never heard of somebody leaving the church because of Jesus, but I've talked to a lot of people who've left the church because of people.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to believe that religious folks, if you're not accepted by them, then you don't have a place in a religious community or a place, with God or whatever. And so it's easy to reject the whole system wholesale. Like Christians, they're judgmental and
Right.
they're hateful and
Right,
they.
and there's especially now in the climate of
hmm
of our culture, right,
hmm
and everything that's happened in the last few years, and there is a lot of disparaging thoughts that are associated with the idea of just being a
Yes.
Christian, you
Oh, yeah,
know?
absolutely. And I think in that we can see how in choosing to send the angels to the shepherds, we can see how those of us who would relate maybe to the shepherds, to those who have been pushed away, to those who have been
Yeah,
rejected, that God is for us so much
right,
so that Jesus was born and
and
and so I think that's just so
and you are
incredibly
included.
yeah, you're included in that. It's difficult to describe, but the clarity in my mind is so significant of how unwritten rules can so easily make us feel like we're pushed to the side. Let's take something really simple. If I were to walk into a church right now in my sweatshirt and my ripped jeans and it was like, a shirt and tie kind of place,
Yeah,
just like, whoa, you don't belong here, you don't look like us. We
yeah,
we look a certain way and we do and we act a
yeah,
certain way and we
and
speak a
we have
certain
long
way.
sleeves on, and we both have, like,
I
tattoos,
know, right?
so,
And
like,
so
we
it's like, oh
really
my God.
yeah,
And so
we're the
yeah,
marginalized.
and so no, I don't.
I'm
I
just kidding, I'm totally
No,
kidding,
yeah.
I'm
And
totally
so
kidding.
I think that we see this parallel here of like, hey, there's faith to be had that happens outside of doors that want to reject you.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
so, and I think we can see that in the shepherds. And I think if you're somebody that's ever felt like that, no pun, like the black sheep, you know? It's
Ba-dum-bum. Yeah.
it's just because somebody else says that you should be excluded doesn't mean that you
Right.
are.
Right.
Just because someone else says that your voice and your words don't matter doesn't mean that they are, because, like, they couldn't testify in court. They could see something terrible happen. Their words had no meaning, and yet your words have meaning to God. He made them the first evangelist. He gave them, like, the words that came out of their mouth led the first folks that came to have an understanding that the Messiah was there. It was their words that brought people in, even though
Yeah.
society said that their words didn't matter and that they weren't significant enough to be loved by God. And yet God goes directly to them to show them how much they're loved and how excited he is
Yeah.
to share the birth of his son with them. And so I just makes me think that you're not excluded.
You're not excluded.
I think that it's so significant that they're intentionally written into the story, right? He was in a manger, and it's so significant. And I think it just can show us that even us as underdogs, we're written to the story, we're a part of the story, and we have a story to tell that can draw people towards God just the same way that the shepherd's story, as they went out and they told others, their story drew people towards God as well because of what God had
Yeah.
shown them and had done for them. And the same is true for us. When we share the story of what God has done for us, it can move that message
Yeah.
forward as
So
well.
if all of this is true,
Mhm.
right? What are we supposed to do with it?
Oh man, this is just
Two things.
two things.
Two
Okay.
things, Sherry, because you could give us 100.
Two things. Yeah, and so let me think of maybe something that we haven't.
Even if it's something that we've already gone over, give us some tangible ways that we can make this truth alive in our life right now.
Okay.
And it may be something simple. It doesn't have to be complex. If God looks at the underdog, at the marginalized, and will meet you where you're at, what do we do with that?
So let's look first at joy over skepticism, because we see this in the shepherds. They
Right.
choose, we see joy in them, we see obedience, we see faith,
Yeah.
and then boldness. And so they let this joy outweigh a skepticism that can so easily come in. Be like, wait, hold on, that community treats me this way. So what can I, am I really important enough to carry this message?
Right. Right. So we can find joy this week.
Yes, absolutely. We can find joy and maybe take that step back away from the skepticism
Yeah,
that I
especially
think,
in this season
yes.
when things are hard.
Hmm.
Finances sometimes can be difficult, like we're running from here to
Hmm.
there. We're knocking down microphones and breaking things. That's a story for another time.
Another day.
But this particular season can be very, very trying for people. And so
Mhm.
to find that joy amidst skepticism.
Draw your eye to the angel and and
Yeah.
not to the society and how they treat you
Ooh,
and what that
draw your
looks
eye
like.
to the angel. I
And
love
so it's
that.
right. It's the song I quoted. It's like, hey, I'm just an addict on my knees with my eyes
Eyes towards,
toward the light.
yeah.
And so it's maybe taking that moment to consider joy over skepticism.
And I think that's enough,
Yeah.
right? I think that's enough
Hmm.
sometimes just to keep it simple and say, look,
Hmm.
this is what they did. We are them. This is what we can do too.
Hmm.
Such a beautiful way to look at the nativity
Hmm.
in such a new, fresh
Hmm.
perspective. So yeah,
Yeah.
so thanks for
Yeah.
sharing all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was absolutely awesome. So have some joy this week.
Have some joy.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah. Eyes on the angel. Is that what you said?
eyes on the angel,
Eyes
eyes
on
toward
the
the light.
eyes towards the light.
Eyes toward the light. Next week, we're going to talk about another set of underdogs, the women in the genealogy of
Ooh,
Jesus. They are intentionally written into the story, and it's
love that.
so significant. And
Yes.
so don't miss that. I think it's going to be really
Yeah.
good.
He sees you. Have a great week.
Have a great week.
Bye.